Get her out of my briefing room. Hammer's voice hit the room like a fist. 40 pilots froze. Arden Vale stood at the mission board, marker in hand, where she had just identified a critical routing flaw that would have put 3 aircraft inside a live threat envelope. She had solved it in 30 seconds. Hammer crossed the room in 4 strides, took the marker from her hand, and erased everything she had written. Nobody asked for your analysis, Vale. He turned to the room. Somebody who actually belongs here want to take a real look at this. The laughter came immediately. Loud, rehearsed, cruel. Not one of them knew her call sign. If you are watching this story right now, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Lieutenant Arden Vale arrived at Naval Air Station Lemoore, California on a Tuesday morning in early November. Carrying one duffel bag over her left shoulder, a flight notebook tucked under her right arm, and the particular kind of quietness that tends to make people in loud rooms deeply uncomfortable. She was 27 years old. She stood 5'4" in her flight boots. She had dark eyes that moved around a room, methodically cataloging detail the way most people catalog faces at a party, quickly, quietly, without drawing attention. She did not shake hands with the energy that aggressive fighter pilots expected from one another. She did not lean back in her chair and tell the story of her best carrier trap before her gear was even stowed. She walked into the ready room on her first morning, found a seat 3 rows from the front, slightly to the left, opened her notebook, and started writing before the coffee on the side table had finished brewing. Several pilots noticed her immediately. None of them were impressed. The squadron at Lemoore was one of the Navy's most competitive. F-18 Super Hornet units in competitive fighter communities have a shared language that takes years to learn, an unspoken dialect made of bravado. War stories, rank-appropriate ribbing, and the constant low hum of ambition that rises every time pilots walk into the same room and look at each other from across the briefing floor. To belong in that language, you had to speak it. You had to enter the conversation. You had to establish quickly and clearly that you were not a background character. Arden Vale acted like someone who had never been told those rules existed. She did not introduce herself beyond what was required. She did not brag. She did not find the corner where the lieutenants were running their informal debrief of the week's training sorties and insert herself with a clever observation about someone else's mistake. She went from the ready room to the simulator. From the simulator back to the ready room. She ate alone or with one other pilot, a smaller, quicker woman named Lieutenant Tessa Rowan, who had been in the squadron long enough to have formed her own opinions and short enough in patience for nonsense that she had very little interest in anyone else's. Her call sign was Switch. She did not explain it to newcomers. Within 4 days of Arden's arrival, the informal verdict was in. Technically qualified, obviously intelligent, but far too quiet to belong in a room full of aggressive fighter pilots. Someone had probably signed the wrong orders. Someone was going to discover sooner or later that the shy girl with the notebook was better suited to training command somewhere on the East Coast than to a fleet tactical unit at Lemoore. These conclusions were reached without evidence. They were stated with complete confidence. That was how it worked in a room full of people who were paid, among other things, for their certainty. Lieutenant Commander Brock Hensley was the loudest advocate for this position. His call sign was Hammer, and he had earned it in the way call signs are earned in fighter communities, not necessarily because he hit hard, but because once he decided something, he kept hitting until the thing broke, or everyone around him agreed. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and had the particular quality of filling a room that comes not from physical size, but from a voice trained to project authority and a laugh that was always half a degree louder than necessary. He had been flying fighters for 11 years. He had done 2 deployments. He was respected genuinely by the junior pilots who studied the way he carried himself, the way pilots study everything, looking for patterns they could replicate. When he looked at Arden Vale on her first day, he saw someone who was going to require patient management. He began gently, the kind of gently that is not gentle at all. Vale, he said, on the second morning, when she was sitting across the planning table from him and had not yet spoken during a 30-minute session that every other pilot in the room had contributed to at least once. This is a discussion. That means voices, plural. She looked at him steadily. I understand. Then you have something to add. Not yet. Hammer looked at the pilot next to him and said nothing. The look said everything. But that was not the moment that set the tone. That happened during the first full tactical briefing of the workup cycle, 6 days after Arden's arrival in a room of 40 people, including 2 senior weapons officers, 3 department heads, and Commander Silas Merrick, the squadron commanding officer who sat in the back row and rarely interrupted briefings, but watched everything with the particular quality of attention that is sometimes mistaken for inattention. The briefing was complex. It involved a layered air-to-ground scenario over simulated contested territory with multiple strike packages, time-on-target coordination problems, and a series of threat response options that the briefer was laying out one by one on the presentation screen. The room was focused. Questions came in from experienced pilots, checking edges of the plan for weaknesses, which is what experienced pilots do when they are being professional, and what they do when they are being competitive. And sometimes these motivations look identical. Arden had been writing steadily since the briefing began. At one point, she stopped writing. She looked at the slide on the screen. She looked back at her notebook. Her pen did not move for almost 30 seconds. Hammer noticed the pause. He leaned slightly toward the pilot beside him. He said something quiet. The pilot bit down on a smile. Then the briefer moved to the threat response section, and the questions escalated, and several of the more experienced pilots were on their feet, now pointing at the imagery, talking over each other slightly, in the way that happens when everyone in a room is confident and no one wants to be the last person to notice the problem. Arden raised her hand. The room slowed. Merrick's range time on the secondary surface threat, she said, and her voice was quiet but clear, not hesitant, just calibrated, measured to exactly the volume required to be heard without over-projecting. The threat reaction window shown on the slide assumes a maximum acquisition range. But this terrain feature, she pointed, it compresses the decision timeline by approximately 30% if we're ingressing from the planned corridor. The package would be inside the envelope before the suppression element has cleared the threat. Silence. The briefer looked at the slide. He looked at the imagery. He said nothing for 3 full seconds. "She's right," said one of the weapons officers from the left side of the room. The briefer nodded slowly. "We need to rebuild the ingress routing." This should have been the moment. In a different room with different people, a catch that significant from a new pilot would have earned at minimum a grudging nod, a moment of recalibration. But the thing about rooms full of confident people is that confidence has a way of protecting itself. The briefer corrected the plan. The discussion moved forward. And Hammer, instead of acknowledging what had just happened, leaned back in his chair and said, in the voice of someone who has already made up his mind, "Vel, do you actually fly fighters, or do you just take notes about them?" The laughter came from 3 pilots. It rolled through the room like something rehearsed. Arden looked at Hammer directly for exactly 2 seconds. Then she closed her notebook. She did not respond. She did not smile. She did not look away first. She simply returned her attention to the screen as if the question had not been asked by anyone interesting enough to answer. Hammer felt the non-response like a small, irritating splinter, somewhere he couldn't quite reach. He would feel it for weeks. What no one in that room understood was that Arden's silence was not an absence of response. It was a choice, deliberate and practiced, made by someone who had learned years earlier that the people who needed to prove themselves loudly in the first 5 minutes were usually the people who had the most to prove. She had watched that dynamic play out enough times that it no longer alarmed her. It barely even interested her. What interested her was the briefing, because there was still a problem with the secondary ingress routing that no one had fully addressed. She wrote it in her notebook and underlined it twice. That evening, after the ready room had mostly cleared and the junior pilots had moved to wherever junior pilots go, when the day officially ends but unofficially continues, Arden stayed at the planning table with her notebook open and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. She pulled up the imagery on the planning system and began working through the routing problem, methodically building a series of alternative corridors and running the math on each one with the kind of patience that looks like stubbornness from the outside but is actually something different. It is what dedication looks like when no one is watching. Switch came in around 9 in the evening, saw the cold coffee and the open notebook and the focused expression, and said nothing for a minute. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee, pulled a chair up to the other side of the table and said, "You're doing the secondary ingress." "Yes. Hammer isn't going to like it if you bring another hole to the briefing." "I know." Switch watched her for a moment. You don't actually care what Hammer likes, do you? It was not quite a question. Arden glanced up briefly. I care about the mission working. Switch nodded slowly in the way of someone who has just received a small piece of information they were not expecting to find useful but intends to keep anyway. She pulled the imagery toward herself and started reviewing it alongside Arden. They worked until 11:30. Nobody rewarded them for it. That was not the point. The following week brought a new layer of difficulty because the workup schedule accelerated and the training sorties moved from relatively controlled scenarios to something more closely resembling the compressed, chaotic, high-stakes environment that fleet aviation actually produces. Fuel margins tightened. Communications problems increased. The scenarios assumed partial degradation of navigation systems and required pilots to fall back on fundamentals that some of them trained in an era of abundant technology had not practiced in years. Arden had practiced them last month. She had practiced them specifically because she noticed during her pre-arrival review of the squadron's training records that the recent annual evaluations had not emphasized instrument-only flying in any sustained way. This was not unusual for a well-equipped, technologically sophisticated unit. It was also, she thought, the kind of thing that became critical at the worst possible moment. She mentioned this to Switch during a simulator session. Switch said, "You reviewed the training records before you got here." "Yes." "From home. I had access through the fleet portal." Switch stared at her. "Who does that?" Arden considered the question seriously. "Someone who knows they're going to be new in a squadron and wants to understand the environment before they arrive." Switch was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know that's not normal." "I know. Most pilots just show up." "I know that too." Switch looked at her for another beat and then turned back to the simulator controls and said nothing else, but there was something in her expression that had changed slightly, the way expressions change when someone revises a theory they thought they had locked down. The next simulator session brought a scenario that nobody was prepared for because that is precisely what well-designed simulator sessions do. The scenario involves simultaneous navigation system, degradation, and a communication link failure during a surface attack profile, which meant the pilots were operating in compressed airspace with limited shared situational awareness and no reliable external reference for their position. Most pilots in the session did what pilots are trained to do. They cross-checked, they communicated, they worked the problem. Some of them worked it well. A few of them got fixated on recovering the failed system instead of working around it, which is a very human mistake to make and a very expensive one in actual flight. Arden experienced the navigation failure and immediately cross-checked her remaining instruments. She identified the discrepancy within 11 seconds. The inertial navigation was feeding corrupted data, while her GPS and radar altimetry remained reliable. She did not try to restart the failed system during the critical phase of flight. She flagged the discrepancy on frequency, in 2 clear sentences adjusted her attack profile to compensate for the degraded navigation picture, and completed the mission with a deviation from planned parameters that was within acceptable limits. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Hammer spent most of it focused on the execution errors of 2 of the junior pilots, which was fair because those errors were significant. But at one point, the simulator instructor made reference to Arden's navigation failure management as a good example of immediate correct prioritization. Hammer said, "That was a simple system cross-check." The instructor looked at him. In 11 seconds, under profile, with a simultaneous comm failure. The room was quiet. "Anyone else complete the mission profile?" the instructor asked. Nobody answered. Arden did not look at Hammer. She was writing in her notebook. Hammer looked at the table. There was a moment brief, almost invisible, where his jaw shifted slightly and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite discomfort but was related to it. It passed quickly. He covered it with a comment about the fuel state management on the Aggress, which was a legitimate critique and allowed the conversation to move forward on his terms. But Switch noticed the moment. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, quietly, without expression, without apparent interest. Later, outside the simulator building, she fell into step beside Arden and said, "He knows." Arden said, "Knows what?" "That he misjudged you." Arden walked without responding for a moment. Then she said, "It doesn't matter." "It will," Switch said, "when he decides whether it makes him sharper or makes him worse toward you." Arden considered this. Either way, it's his problem to work out. Switch almost smiled. Yeah, she said, it is. 2 days later, Arden arrived at the simulator building at 5:15 in the morning. The building was not empty. Commander Silas Merrick was in the small office adjacent to the main simulator bay reviewing a printout. He was in his mid-40s, leaning the way of people who are constitutionally incapable of stillness, with gray coming in at his temples and an expression that was not unkind but was entirely unreadable. He had commanded the squadron for 16 months. In that time, he had watched pilots arrive with enormous reputations and underperform, and he had watched quiet arrivals grow into something the squadron needed without knowing it needed it. He had learned to watch carefully and say little. He had been watching Arden since her first day. He heard the door and looked up. Vale, he said, not surprised, not particularly unsurprised. Sir, Arden said, I wanted to run the secondary ingress routing problem on the sim before the brief at 08. Merrick looked at her for a moment. There's no scheduled sim time until 07:30. I know. I'll be done by then. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, sit down. She sat. Merrick put the printout down and folded his hands on the desk. He had a way of sitting that made the desk feel smaller. How long have you been doing this, coming in early? Since I arrived. Every day. Most days. He was quiet. Then why? Arden seemed to consider whether to answer honestly and decided that the commanding officer of her squadron probably deserved the honest version. Because the scenario complexity increases significantly next week and I haven't flown this terrain profile in this aircraft block in over a year. I don't want to be the person the squadron waits on. Merrick looked at her steadily. You reviewed the training records before you got here, he said. It was not a question. Arden paused. Yes, sir. The fleet portal access logs show a review session 11 days before your report date. He said it without accusation. I checked. She was quiet. Why did you check? He asked. She looked at him directly. Because the secondary ingress has a problem that I thought needed to be caught before we briefed it to a room of 40 people. And was it? Not completely. Merrick looked at her for a long time. Then he said, Vale. Sir, go run your simulator session. She stood. And Vale, he said, before she reached the door. She turned. I'm going to pull your personnel file today. He said it plainly without drama. The full one, not the summary. Arden looked at him. Her expression gave nothing away. Yes, sir. She left. Merrick sat at his desk for a moment after the door closed, looking at the printout in front of him. Then he pulled open his desk drawer, took out a separate folder and opened it. He began reading. For the rest of that week, training continued at the accelerating pace that pre-deployment workups produced compressed schedules, late evenings, the steady accumulation of pressure that is designed to find the places where pilots and crews crack under stress, because it is far better to find those places in a training environment than find them over contested territory with weapons engaged. Arden flew every sortie scheduled and two that other pilots could not complete for scheduling reasons. She did not make a point of it. She signed up, flew, and debriefed. She continued arriving early. She continued staying late. She stopped going to the bar after hours, not because she disliked the social environment, but because she had calculated fairly precisely that her greatest deficit in this squadron was not social standing, but currency in the specific threat environment they were training for, and the most efficient use of her evenings was study rather than conversation. Switch noticed this and said at one point, you know other people exist. Arden said, I know. We do occasionally have conversations that are not about mission planning. I've heard. Switch stared at her. Come to the bar tonight, 1 hour, talk to people. Arden was quiet, then with the particular expression of someone performing a cost-benefit analysis in real time. 1 hour. 1 hour, Switch agreed. She lasted 45 minutes, which Switch counted as a win. Hammer was at the bar that evening in his usual position, center of a cluster of junior pilots who were listening to him reconstruct a training engagement from the previous week. He told it well, he was good at that. The story moved, it had the right pace. It gave the junior pilots something to learn inside its entertainment. And it gave Hammer something he needed, the steady verification that he mattered in a room that was full of people who needed to believe they mattered. He noticed Arden arrive. He noticed Switch guiding her in with a hand at her elbow. He noticed a position slightly outside the main cluster. accept a glass of water from the bar, and speak to a lieutenant junior grade named Calloway who was asking her something earnest and low-voiced about the navigation failure scenario from the simulator session. Hammer watched her answer Calloway. She was patient, more patient than he would have been with a junior grade asking technical questions at the bar. She did not talk down. She drew something on a cocktail napkin with a borrowed pen. Calloway nodded, then Calloway nodded again with the expression of someone who has just watched something confusing become clear. Hammer looked away. He told the rest of his story. It landed well. He accepted the laughter and went back to his drink. But the image of Arden, bent over a cocktail napkin explaining a navigation failure to a junior grade who had been struggling all week, stayed with him longer than he expected. He replayed her answer in the briefing room. The threat reaction window, the terrain compression, the timing on the suppression element. She had seen that faster than anyone else in the room. He pressed the thought down and ordered another drink. 2 days later, Commander Merrick arrived at the ready room with a folder under his arm and a look that pilots learned to recognize, not alarm, but heightened attention, the expression of a commanding officer who has just received information that requires reassessment. He sat down at the planning table. He said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at the scheduling board where the call sign column still read VL beside Arden's tail number. He looked at it for a long time. Hammer came in at that moment, coffee in hand, and followed the CO's eyes to the board. "Something wrong with the schedule, sir." Merrick looked at him. "No," he said. "I'm thinking about something." "About Vale." Merrick looked at the board again. "About what I didn't know," he said. Hammer frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I pulled her full file," Merrick said. "Not the summary, the full restricted record." Hammer waited. "There are pages in that file," Merrick said carefully, "that I was not expecting." Hammer stared at him. "Pages about what?" Merrick looked at him directly, and for a long moment he said absolutely nothing, which was an answer of its own. "Sir," Hammer said, and his voice had shifted slightly, had lost some of the confidence it usually carried. "What kind of pages?" Merrick closed the folder. He stood. He said, "Pay closer attention," in the voice of a commanding officer who is giving an instruction, not offering a suggestion. Then he left. Hammer stood at the planning table alone, looking at the schedule board, at the single word where a call sign should have been, Vale. He had assumed since her arrival that the absence of a call sign was because she was new and hadn't yet had one assigned. In fleet communities, call signs were earned in training, sometimes through accomplishment and sometimes through embarrassing mishap, and newcomers occasionally arrived between units without one reflecting their current assignment. He had not considered the other possibility, that a call sign existed and had been deliberately omitted. He stared at the board, and for the first time since Arden Vale had arrived in his squadron, Lieutenant Commander Brock Hensley felt something he was not accustomed to feeling in a ready room. He felt uncertain. The question sat at the back of his mind for the rest of the week, like a frequency he couldn't tune out, always there underneath everything else, quiet and persistent. What pages? What kind of file required a full restricted pull from a commanding officer? What was in the record of a 27-year-old lieutenant who sat 3 rows from the front, took notes, arrived before sunrise, and had not since the day she walked in given a single person in this squadron a clear reason to take her seriously? What had she done that required those pages to be separate? Hammer did not ask Merrick again. He was experienced enough to know when a commanding officer's tone meant the conversation was over. But he began watching Arden differently, not with the lazy dismissiveness that had been his default since her arrival, but with the sharper, more deliberate attention of someone trying to solve a problem he did not have all the variables for. What he saw once he actually looked was not what he had decided to see. He watched her talk to Calloway again during a planning session. He watched how she listened, not politely, not while thinking of her next point, but in the way of someone who is actually processing what is being said and weighing it against what she already knows. He watched how she managed the 3-way conversation between herself, Calloway, and a second lieutenant named Price, who had different opinions about the optimal egress routing, and how she let both of them argue and then said 3 sentences that incorporated the valid part of each position and discarded the rest, and how Calloway and Price both nodded as if this had been their conclusion all along. He watched her in the simulator on a sortie. He wasn't flying, but was monitoring as part of his instructor duty. He watched how she moved through the scenario, not aggressively, not passively, but with the patient, forward-looking rhythm of someone who is always thinking several seconds ahead, of where the aircraft currently is. He did not like how much he was noticing. He did not like what it implied about how little he had noticed before. On Thursday of that week, during a break between sorties, he found himself standing near the coffee station at the same time as Switch. Switch was the kind of person you could ask questions of without the questions implying too much, because she had a reputation for precision over judgment and was known to answer things directly. He said casually, as if it weren't the question he had been sitting on for days, "What do you know about Vale?" Switch looked at him over her coffee cup. She said, What do you mean, background, before she got here?" Switch was quiet for a moment. Then, why? Merrick pulled her full file, Hammer said there were pages he wasn't expecting. Switch continued looking at him. Her expression did not change. "And you want to know what's in the pages?" "I want to understand who she is." Switch put her coffee down. She looked at him directly and said in the voice of someone who has made a decision about how to answer, "I think you should ask her." Hammer stared at her. "Vale doesn't talk." "She talks," Switch said. "She just doesn't perform." She picked up her coffee. "There's a difference." She walked away. Hammer stood at the coffee station and looked at the wall, the difference between talking and performing. He replayed every interaction he had watched, every briefing, every debrief, every bar conversation he had observed from across the room, every question Arden had asked or answered or declined to answer, and tried to find the line between the two. He had been performing since he walked into this squadron 11 years ago. He had never once thought about the distinction. Somewhere in a hangar at Nas Lamore, inside the maintenance bay where the Super Hornet sat between sorties, a deck crew chief named Rodriguez was arguing with a quality assurance representative about a hydraulic anomaly. Neither of them knew that 2 days later that anomaly would surface during a training mission in weather that nobody had predicted correctly in terrain that offered very few good options, with a pilot whose fuel state would be tighter than the flight schedule had planned for, and that the quiet pilot everyone had spent 3 weeks ignoring would be the person who figured out how to bring everyone home. But that was 2 days away. Right now, Arden Vale was sitting in the simulator, running the secondary ingress routing for the 4th time that week, making the same turn she had been practicing since 5 in the morning. She was not trying to become Wraith. She didn't even think about that name unless she had to. She was trying to be ready. Because her father had told her, standing beside a crop duster in a Montana field when she was 14 years old, and the wind was coming in wrong, and the clouds were building to the west with the particular darkening that meant the afternoon was about to become something entirely different from what the morning had been. You can't control the sky, Arden. You can only control what you did before you got in it. She had written that in the first page of every flight notebook she had ever owned. She was on her 7th notebook now. The cover was worn. The first page always said the same thing. She ran the ingress turn again. The laughter was still in the air when Arden walked out of the briefing room. She did not slam the door. She did not look back. She walked the length of the corridor with the same measured stride she always used, turned the corner, and pushed through the side exit into the cold morning air. She stood there for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went back inside, walked to the simulator scheduling office, and signed up for the next available open block. That was how she handled it. That was how she had always handled it. Switch found her 40 minutes later in the simulator bay, already strapped into the trainer, with her knee board sorted and her pre-brief notes open on her knee. Switch stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, looking at the back of Arden's helmet through the plexiglass. Then she opened the door and said, "You know what he did was out of line." Arden did not look up from her notes. "Yes." Merrick was in the room. "I know, and he saw the whole thing." "I know that too." Switch crossed her arms. "So you're just going to sit in a simulator?" Arden finally looked up. Her expression was not wounded, and it was not hardened. It was simply resolved, the way a person looks when they have made a decision that costs them something, but that they are not going to reverse. "Hammer erased my work," she said. "That doesn't make the routing problem disappear. It still exists. Someone needs to solve it before we brief the full package." Switch stared at her. "Are you going to help me?" Arden said. "Or are you going to stand in the door?" Switch pulled up a seat. They worked for 2 hours. What Switch understood about Arden in pieces, in increments over those 2 hours, was something she could not have explained to anyone in the ready room in language they would have accepted. It was not that Arden was exceptional in the ways fighter pilots typically celebrated. Not louder, not more aggressive, not more visually dramatic in the cockpit. What she was in a way Switch was still learning to name was structurally different in how she processed a problem. Most pilots, even excellent ones, worked a problem forward. Here is where I am, here is where the threat is, here is what I do next. Arden worked simultaneously forward and backward. She was always asking not just what position an aircraft currently held, but what position every aircraft would hold in the next 6 seconds, the next 12, the next 30. And she was doing this for multiple aircraft at once, including her own, including threats, including friendlies, who might drift from their briefed parameters, including the terrain that would constrain everyone's options as the mission developed. It was like watching someone play three-dimensional chess while everyone else was playing checkers, and she had no idea how unusual it was. That was the part Switch couldn't get over. Arden had not arrived at Limor with a performance prepared. She was not trying to impress anyone. She had not calculated that this particular skill set would make people respect her. She simply operated this way because it was how she had taught herself to fly incrementally over years in the aftermath of one bad engagement in advanced training that she had then spent an entire night reviewing. Switch knew this because she had finally asked, directly because that was Switch's method. When did you start thinking ahead of the aircraft? Arden looked at her. I don't understand the question. Yes, you do. A pause. Advanced training, Arden said. I lost a simulated engagement because I fixated on one threat and forgot about everything else. My instructor killed me in about 4 seconds. I watched the recording for 6 hours. And I realized that my strongest instinct, total concentration, was also my biggest vulnerability. So I started practicing seeing everything at the same time. How long did that take to learn? Arden thought about it seriously, which was what she did with all questions she actually respected. I'm still learning it, she said, but it started working reliably about 18 months in. Switch absorbed this. Then she said, Hammer has no idea what he's looking at. Arden was quiet for a moment. Most people don't. That's not his fault. Switch looked at her sharply. He erased your work in front of 40 people. Yes, Arden said, that part is his fault. Switch almost laughed. She did not, but it was close. The routing solution they built that afternoon was cleaner than the original plan by a significant margin. It reduced the time the strike package spent inside the compressed threat envelope by 38% and eliminated the suppression timing problem entirely by shifting the ingress axis by 11 degrees. It required slightly more fuel on the egress, which meant the package would need to tighten its recovery sequencing, but that was a manageable constraint compared to the alternative. Arden wrote the brief summary in her notebook and filed a planning note through the formal documentation channel that night, attributed to both herself and Switch without drama, without covering language, without any of the political softening that junior officers are typically advised to apply when submitting corrections to plans developed by senior officers. It was correct. It needed to be in the record. She put it there. Hammer found it the next morning. He read it standing at the planning station with his coffee going cold in his other hand. He read it twice. He looked at the mathematics. He looked at the terrain overlay. He looked at the timing comparison between the original plan and the revised one. His jaw moved. He said nothing. But Merrick was watching from across the room, and when Hammer set the document down and walked away without acknowledging it, Merrick picked it up. He read it carefully. He read it the way he read everything Arden produced, with that quiet, accumulating attention that was slowly building into something. He set the document down. He went to his office and opened the folder he had pulled 2 days earlier. He turned to a specific section, the restricted operational evaluation from Arden's previous assignment, and read 3 paragraphs he had already read 4 times. He turned to the final page. He looked at the single word at the bottom of the last paragraph where the evaluating officer had written a summary observation that was unusual in its directness, because operational evaluation summaries were typically written in the careful, hedged language of institutional documents, and this one was not. The word was not Arden's name. Merrick looked at it for a long time, then he closed the folder. He did not put it back in the drawer. He kept it on his desk. That same week, the workup schedule pushed into its most demanding phase, and the squadron was flying twice daily with planning sessions, bracketing each sortie block. The fatigue was real, the kind that settles behind the eyes and in the shoulders and makes small errors more frequent. which was partly the point because you needed to know what your pilots did when tired before you trusted them in conditions that would make tired look like a luxury. Arden flew every sortie. She also, during this period, did something that nobody asked her to do, and nobody initially noticed she was doing. She began spending time with the junior pilots in the squadron. Not the aggressive, confident ones who were already competing for profile in the ready room, but the quieter ones, the ones who were still working out how to ask questions in a community that sometimes treated questions as evidence of weakness. There were three of them in this cycle: Calloway, who was sharp but hesitant, Price, who was aggressive but undisciplined, and a lieutenant junior grade named Maeve Chen, who was technically brilliant and socially terrified of every senior pilot in the room, and who had not spoken above a murmur in any group setting since her arrival. Arden noticed Chen first. She noticed her the same way she had been noticed, or rather not noticed, on her own first days. A quiet person in the back of a loud room, absorbing everything, contributing nothing, not because she had nothing to offer, but because the room had already made its judgment and she had no language for challenging it. She pulled Chen aside after a planning session that Chen had sat through in complete silence despite having the most current experience with one of the threat systems being discussed. "You know the threat picture better than anyone in that room," Arden said. Chen looked at her. "I'm a JG. That doesn't change what you know." Chen was quiet then. "Nobody's going to listen. You don't know that yet. I have a pretty good idea." Arden looked at her for a moment. Then she said something that was not inspirational and was not a speech and was not the kind of thing that gets written on a poster. She said, "The first time I spoke up in a briefing at Lemoore, a lieutenant commander asked me in front of 40 people whether I actually flew fighters or just took notes about them." She paused. "Speak anyway." Chen stared at her. Arden said, "What's the threat acquisition timeline on the system they were briefing?" Chen told her. She knew it precisely to within a half-second margin, and her reasoning was technically exact. Arden said, "Tomorrow, say that, exactly that." Chen said nothing. But the next day in the planning session, when the threat timeline came up and two senior pilots were arguing about a figure that was slightly wrong, Maeve, Chen said quietly but clearly, "The acquisition timeline is 4.3 seconds at maximum range. It compresses to 2.8 inside 30 nautical miles." The room paused. The briefer checked his reference. He looked up. "That's correct." The senior pilot, who had been arguing, revised his position without acknowledging Chen directly, which was a kind of institutional rudeness, so normalized in competitive environments that most people didn't even register it as rude. Arden registered it, but she also registered Chen's face, the barely visible shift of expression, the moment when a person realizes for the first time that the knowledge they have been carrying in silence is actually worth something in the world outside their own head. That moment mattered. It mattered more than most of what happened in official debrief channels that week. Meanwhile, Hammer was dealing with something he could not put down. The document Arden and Switch had filed the routing correction had been quietly incorporated into the revised plan by the operations department without attribution in the briefing itself, which was the kind of institutional maneuvering that happened all the time and was usually accepted as the cost of doing business in large organizations. Hammer knew the correction had come from Arden. Everyone who had been paying attention knew it, but the briefing presented it as a general planning refinement and moved forward. Hammer had let that happen. He had not objected to the non-attribution. He had not corrected the record. He had walked into the briefing, heard his own operations department present, Arden's correction as routine planning work, and said nothing. He did not feel good about this. He felt less good when Switch looked at him across the briefing room with an expression that communicated with the economy of someone who had practiced precision for years exactly what she thought of his silence. "I went to the bar that evening and drank one beer and left before anyone tried to talk to him. He drove to the base housing and sat in his car for a few minutes in the dark. He had been flying for 11 years. He had deployed twice. He had led combat training sorties and had done well, and had the evaluations to prove it. He was not in his private, honest accounting a bad officer. He was not corrupt or malicious. He had simply made the kind of mistake that confident people make. When they stop checking their confidence against evidence, he had decided what Arden was before watching her, and having decided he had stopped watching. The problem was that now he was watching, and everything he saw was the opposite of what he had decided. The routing correction, the simulator performance, the threat timeline she had caught in the initial brief, the way Chen had stood up in a planning session because Arden had told her to. Small things accumulating. The quiet competence of someone who was not performing competence, who was simply steadily, unremarkably competent in the way that matters most, which is the way that holds up when the pressure is real and the conditions are bad and there is nobody watching to validate the performance. I thought about what Merrick had said. Pay closer attention. He had thought at the time that Merrick meant pay closer attention to Arden's flying. He was beginning to think Merrick had meant something larger than that. The following week brought a weather system that nobody had forecast accurately, a cold front that pushed through faster than predicted, dropping ceilings and compressing the training windows, and requiring on-the-fly replanning of 2 sortie packages that had taken days to build. The kind of problem that a well-organized squadron manages and a poorly organized squadron panics over, and the difference between the two outcomes usually comes down to which pilots are able to shift from executing a plan to improvising within constraints without losing their nerve or their situational awareness. Arden was in the duty officer seat when the weather call came in. She had not volunteered for the duty. She had been assigned it as a routine rotation. She was sitting with the weather data and the fuel state sheets in the sortie schedule when the report came that the front was moving faster than predicted and the primary range was going to close within the hour. She picked up the phone and called operations. Then she called the flight schedule coordinator. Then she went to the board and started drawing alternative windows. Hammer came in 20 minutes to the replanning effort already in his flight gear and stopped when he saw the board. 3 alternative schedule windows with fuel options annotated for each, with threat range timing adjusted for the compressed weather window, with recovery sequencing that accounted for the ceiling restrictions that were now in effect. Arden was on the phone talking to the range control authority in a voice that was calm and clear and completely unhurried. Hammer looked at the board. He looked at it the way he had learned to look at things this week, actually looking, not confirming what he had already decided. She had done in 20 minutes what would have taken him 40, and she had not done it to impress anyone. She had done it because it was her duty day, and this was the problem in front of her, and solving it was the job. When she hung up the phone and turned around, Hammer was still standing there. He said, the secondary window on the board, does the fuel state account for the extended ground hold? She looked at the board. The calculation uses the updated engine startup time from the revised weather brief. It's tight, but within limits. He nodded slowly. What's the buffer? 4 minutes on the primary recovery sequence, she said. Less if the ceiling drops further. He looked at the board for another moment. What do you need me to do? She looked at him. It was the first time he had offered her anything except obstruction. She said, check the fuel state on the secondary package. The operations board hasn't confirmed the upload numbers yet. Done, he said. He went to the operations board. Neither of them acknowledged what had just happened. There was no dramatic pause, no moment of explicit recognition. He had asked what she needed. She had told him. He had gone to do it. That was the entire exchange. But Switch, who had come in 2 minutes earlier and positioned herself near the coffee station without attracting attention, had seen the whole thing. And she thought, without making any outward indication of the thought, there it is, there it is. The sortie packages flew that afternoon in the compressed window Arden had built. The ceilings held. The fuel states were tight on the secondary package exactly as she had calculated, and the recoverer sequencing required the kind of precise discipline that junior pilots sometimes struggled with. But Callaway and Price, both of whom had been quietly improving under the combination of Arden's informal coaching and the pressure of an accelerating workup schedule, hit their windows within 30 seconds of planned, which was good flying. Nobody landed short. Nobody had to declare emergency fuel. The sortie succeeded. In the debrief, the operations officer reviewed the weather replanning sequence as part of the daily report and noted that the duty officer's response to the unexpected front closure had maintained training continuity for the full package. He did not name Arden. He said, duty officer response. Hammer looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said to the room, for the record, the duty officer was Lieutenant Vale, and she rebuilt the entire schedule in 20 minutes from a cold start. The room was quiet. Merrick in the back row looked at Hammer. Hammer was not looking at Merrick. He was looking at the briefing screen. Arden did not look at either of them. She was writing in her notebook, but her pen for just a moment stopped moving. That was all. Merrick left the debrief without speaking to anyone. He walked to his office. He opened the drawer where he had put the folder, except it was not in the drawer because he had not put it back in the drawer because he had been returning to it every day for a week. He sat down, he opened it to the final page of the restricted operational evaluation. He read the last paragraph again. The evaluating officer, a commander whose name Merrick recognized from joint publications, had written the pilot designated in this evaluation demonstrated in conditions of active mission, degradation, and crew distress, a capacity for distributed situational awareness under extreme time and fuel pressure that this office has not observed at this frequency or consistency in an aviator at this experience level. The actions taken during the period under review directly contributed to the safe recovery of an aircraft and crew that by the assessments of all parties present would not otherwise have returned. The call sign assigned by the unit following this event is noted in the attachment. Attribution has been withheld at the request of the evaluated pilot. Merrick turned to the attachment. One word. He had read it 6 times now. It still landed the same way. He closed the folder. He opened his desk drawer and took out a dry erase marker. He sat at his desk for a long moment, turning the marker in his hand. Somewhere in the building, he could hear the distant sound of the ready room pilots, talking chairs scraping the low administrative hum of a squadron at work. He could hear Arden's voice at one point, patient and clear, answering something one of the junior grades had asked. He turned the marker over once more. Then he stood up. He had been commanding this squadron for 16 months, and in that time he had learned that the most important information in any unit was usually not the loudest. The most important things traveled quietly, arrived without announcement, and were missed entirely by people who were not paying the right kind of attention. He had been paying the right kind of attention for 3 weeks. He walked to the scheduling board in the ready room. He uncapped the marker. The room did not notice him immediately. Conversations continued. Calloway was going over notes with Price. Switch was reviewing a weather chart. Hammer was standing near the back of the room, talking to the operations officer about the following day's sortie sequence. Arden was at the planning table. Merrick looked at the scheduling board. He found her tail number. He found the call sign column. He looked at the single word that was there. Venu. He reached up and he erased it. The dry erase marker squeaked against the board. The sound was small. Conversations paused. Heads turned, not all at once, but in the way of people who register a change in a familiar environment without knowing what the change is yet. Merrick wrote one word, 7 letters. He recapped the marker. He turned around. The room had gone completely quiet. Hammer was reading the board from across the room. His expression had changed. Something had moved through it rapidly, a kind of recognition that looked almost like impact, the face of someone who has just understood something they were not ready to understand. Switch looked at the board. Her expression did not change. But her eyes moved to Arden. Arden was still at the planning table. She was not looking at the board. She was looking at the table surface, and her pen was in her hand, and she was very still in the way of someone who knew something was happening and had chosen to give it exactly the weight it deserved, which was not none, but was not everything either. Merrick said nothing. He went back to his office. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Hammer said from across the room in a voice that was different from any voice Arden had heard him use before, not commanding, not dismissive, not performing veil. She looked up. He was reading the board. Wraith, he said, not a question, a recognition, like a man saying the name of a place he has heard of but never expected to find himself standing in. You're Wraith. The word landed in the room like something physical. Switch watched Hammer. She watched Arden. Arden looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back down at her notebook, and she said quietly, with no drama and no performance, and no trace of the satisfaction she might have been entitled to after 3 weeks of being dismissed in this room. Yes, sir. The pen began moving again. The word stayed on the board all night. Nobody erased it. Nobody moved it. Nobody questioned whether it belonged there because the silence that had followed Merrick's marker had communicated something that words would have made smaller. By the time the ready room cleared that evening, Wraith was simply part of the board, the way the tail numbers were part of the board, and the sortie windows were part of the board, factual, fixed, requiring no further explanation. But the questions were already moving through the squadron like current through wire. Calloway asked Price in a low voice outside the simulator building whether he knew what Wraith meant. Price said he had heard the name somewhere, maybe in a training publication, maybe in something that had circulated through the fleet, but he couldn't place it exactly. Chen said nothing but went back to her quarters and pulled up every after-action summary she could access through the fleet portal, searching for a reference, finding fragments, finding the edges of something that had been deliberately kept vague. Switch said nothing to anyone that evening. She already knew. She had known for 2 weeks, pieced together from 3 separate conversations with pilots at her previous squadron who had been adjacent to the deployment in question, not present, not directly involved, but close enough to have heard the radio traffic that night and to have understood, in the way aviators understand things that happen at the edge of their operational awareness, that something unusual had occurred and that the pilot responsible had not wanted the credit. She had put it together 11 days after Arden's arrival. She had not said a word, because it was not her story to tell. Hammer went home that night, sat at his kitchen table and called a former squadron mate who had been on the deployment where the Wraith incident occurred. The call lasted 22 minutes. For most of those 22 minutes, Hammer was silent, listening with his hand flat on the table and his coffee untouched and his face doing something complicated that nobody was there to see. When the call ended, he sat for a long time. Then he said to nobody, "I erased her work." He said it the way a person says something, when the weight of it has finally arrived at full size, when the intellectual understanding of a mistake becomes something physical and located in the chest. He had erased her work, done it in front of 40 people. He had handed the marker to someone else and made a joke about it, and the room had laughed, and he had felt in that moment the particular satisfaction of a man who has successfully maintained his position. What he had actually maintained was his ignorance. He understood that now. He did not sleep particularly well. The next morning, the squadron came in to find Merrick already at the planning table, not reviewing documents, not on the phone, but sitting with a cup of coffee, and the particular quality of waiting that commanding officers develop when they have something to say and are choosing their moment carefully. Pilots filed in, the ready room filled, the ambient noise built to its usual level, and then gradually became aware of Merrick's presence and quieted itself down by several degrees without anyone acknowledging that this was happening. Merrick waited until the room was full. Then he said without preamble, "Some of you have questions about the call sign on the board. I'm going to answer them, and then we're going to move on. And the reason we're going to move on is that the pilot in question would prefer we do exactly that, which should tell you something about the pilot in question." The room was very still. 14 months ago, Merrick said, "During a deployment, I won't specify, a Super Hornet experienced a flight control malfunction during a nighttime recovery evolution in degraded weather. The crew was disoriented, fuel was critical, the aircraft was by every standard metric in serious trouble." He paused. A second aircraft operating with its own fuel margins already at the edge of acceptable stayed with the damaged aircraft, provided navigation assistance, helped the crew work their emergency procedures, maintained radio contact through 3 separate communication dropouts, guided them to a recovery point that the damaged crew, given their disorientation, would not have found independently. Another pause. The second aircraft landed with fuel state that the maintenance crew documented as the lowest they had seen on a Super Hornet that did not subsequently require a mishap report. The room did not move. The pilot of that second aircraft, Merrick said, did not report the action through standard channels, did not request recognition, asked specifically that the incident not be attributed by name in the after-action summary. He looked around the room. The crews who were on frequency that night gave her the call sign themselves, because she appeared when she was needed, did exactly what needed to be done, and then, as far as the radio was concerned, simply wasn't there anymore. Complete silence. Merrick picked up his coffee. He said, "Her name is Lieutenant Arden Vale. She has been in this squadron for 3 weeks. Some of you decided what she was before watching her fly." He looked at no one specifically and at everyone completely. "I'd encourage a revision." He stood up. He walked out. The room sat in its silence for a full 10 seconds after the door closed. Then Hammer said, without looking at anyone, "Brief in 20 minutes. His voice was flat and professional and gave nothing away. "Let's get to work." People moved, but the air in the room had changed. It had the particular quality of a space where something has been permanently rearranged, where the furniture of assumption has been shifted, and everyone is still adjusting to the new geography. Arden was at the planning table. She had been there quietly through Merrick's entire account. She had not looked up from her notebook. She had not changed her posture or her expression. She had simply continued writing with a particular focused stillness of someone who has heard something about themselves that they have not chosen to make public and who is now waiting patiently for the room to move past it. Calloway came to the planning table first. I was 24 years old and had not yet learned to perform his emotions before he felt them, which made him in certain moments the most honest person in the room. He sat down across from Arden and said, "I didn't know." Arden looked up. "I mean, none of us knew," Calloway said. "And I wanted to say, that's what you did. That's—" He stopped. He did not have the language for it yet. Arden looked at him directly. "How's your fuel state calculation on the secondary recovery coming?" Calloway blinked. It's almost done. Bring it to me when it is." He nodded. He got up. At the door, he stopped and looked back. He said, "Wraith." Just the word. Not sarcastically, not reverentially, just acknowledging it, like placing a coin on a table. Arden did not respond, but something in her eyes very briefly shifted by 1 degree. Not pride, closer to the complicated feeling of a person who has carried a name they did not choose for a long time and is still not sure what to do with it. Then she looked back at her notebook. The brief ran at full length and without incident, which in the current state of the squadron meant something, because the current state of the squadron was one of adjusted attention, of people looking at things more carefully than they had the day before, of junior pilots listening to senior ones, with a specific quality of recalibration that happens when a belief has been upended and needs to be rebuilt. Hammer ran the brief. He ran IT precisely, thoroughly, without any of the performative edge that had become his default in large briefings. He acknowledged 2 planning corrections that had come from the duty officer's weather replanning session, without naming Arden, then corrected himself mid-sentence and said her name. He did it in the voice of a man performing a small act of discipline, not dramatic, not emotional, simply accurate. Arden wrote in her notebook. The brief moved forward. What happened 2 days later was not dramatic in the way people expect drama to arrive. It did not announce itself. It came in sideways, the way actual crises come quietly inside something routine, already moving fast before anyone realized it was moving at all. The multinational exercise had been building toward its peak evaluation phase. Partner nation aircraft were operating in the training ranges alongside the squadron. The airspace was more complex than anything they had run in the workup period, and the sortie packages were large and layered, requiring precise coordination across multiple flight leads in 2 different command and control agencies. Arden was flying as part of a 4-ship package on the exercise's 3rd major day of operations. Her position in the formation was not the lead role. Hammer was leading the package, but a tactical coordination position that required her to maintain awareness of the entire formation status while also executing her own mission responsibilities. It was a job that rewarded the kind of distributed situational awareness that Switch had been watching her exercise for weeks. The package launched on time. For 40 minutes, it went exactly as briefed. Then at a point in the mission that the exercise scenario had not included, one of the partner nation aircraft began showing symptoms. The radio call came in fragmented, partly in the partner nation's language, partly in English, with the particular jagged urgency of a crew managing multiple problems at once and trying to communicate in a second language under stress. The aircraft's primary flight control surface was responding abnormally. The crew was not declaring an emergency, not yet, but the flight lead's voice had acquired the specific tension of someone whose internal assessment and their radio discipline were pulling in different directions. Hammer responded immediately. His training was evident, his voice was controlled, his initial questions were correct. He asked for the aircraft's current status, its fuel state, its heading. The answers came back fragmented. The problem was that the communications between the partner nation crew and the control agency were degrading, not a failure but a compression, a situation where 3 different people needed to talk at the same time, and the frequency was becoming cluttered in a way that was slowing the information flow exactly when speed was critical. Arden listened to the first 30 seconds of the radio exchange. Then she did something that nobody instructed her to do. She shifted frequencies, established a direct link with the distressed aircraft's wingman, and asked a single precise question in clean, slow English. What is your lead's current fuel state, and what heading gives him the longest overland recovery window? The wingman answered immediately. She did the math in her head. She had the terrain picture from her pre-mission study, not vague familiarity, but the specific kind of knowledge that comes from reviewing the recovery corridors the night before and asking herself, as she always asked herself, where is the worst place for something to go wrong and what are the options from there? She came back on the primary frequency. Hammer Wraith. Her voice was level. Distressed aircraft optimal recovery heading is 045. Terrain clears at that heading for 18 nautical miles. Fuel supports the route if he starts the turn now. A half-second pause. Hammer said, confirm 045. Confirmed, he needs to start now. Hammer relayed the heading. The distressed aircraft turned. What followed was 11 minutes of compressed, demanding, intensely focused radio work. Arden, maintaining the direct link with the wingman, while Hammer coordinated with the control agency, the two of them operating on parallel tracks that were feeding each other information without stepping on each other's communications, a kind of aerial two-part harmony that neither of them had rehearsed and that required each of them to trust the other's judgment in real time without verification. There was a moment 8 minutes into the recovery where the control agency came back with an alternative routing that was geometrically shorter, but that crossed terrain that Arden's pre-mission review had flagged as problematic in degraded visibility. The visibility was now degraded. She said on the command frequency clearly, negative on the alternate routing. Terrain clearance is not sufficient in current conditions. The control agency pushed back. Arden said, I have the terrain picture from tonight's brief. The alternate route requires minimum ceiling of 4,000 feet. Current ceiling at that point is 2,800. The original routing is the safe option. Silence on the frequency. Hammer said, Wraith is correct. Original routing. Continue. The control agency complied. 4 minutes later, the distressed aircraft crossed into the recovery pattern with fuel sufficient for one approach. 1. It landed on the first attempt. The crew shut down on the runway because the fuel state was critical enough that taxiing to the ramp was a decision that required authorization. They were safe. The debrief that evening was long and thorough and attended by personnel from 3 different organizations. The partner nation liaison officer spoke at length about the communications management during the recovery and at one point asked directly who had established the direct link with his aircraft's wingman in the early phase. Hammer said without hesitation, Lieutenant Vale, call sign Wraith. The liaison officer looked at Arden. He said something in his own language, first then translated it himself. In our Air Force, we have a phrase. The pilot who is quiet in the briefing room and loud in the emergency. We say this person has the right kind of voice. He paused. She has the right kind of voice. Arden looked at him. She said, your wingman gave me everything I needed. He was precise and calm. Thank him. The liaison officer nodded. He wrote something in his own notebook. The debrief continued. Merrick sat in the back row and did not speak during the formal session. He had a folder open on his knee, the same folder he had been carrying for 2 weeks, and he was not reading it. He was watching Arden navigate the debrief with the same quality he had been watching her navigate everything else, without performance, without positioning, without any apparent interest in managing how she appeared. He thought about the line in the restricted evaluation, a capacity for distributed situational awareness, under extreme time and fuel pressure, that this office has not observed at this frequency or consistency in an aviator at this experience level. He had read that line 9 times now. He now knew what it looked like in practice. What happened next was not planned by Merrick. It was not a ceremony or a formal recognition or the kind of staged moment that gets commemorated in squadron photos. It happened the way the most real things happen, almost accidentally in the middle of something else without announcement. The debrief wrapped. People began gathering notebooks and water bottles and moving toward the door. The room was loud again with the particular post-exercise energy of people who have been through something demanding and come out the other side. That combination of release and residual focus that takes an hour to fully dissipate. Merrick walked to the front of the room. He uncapped his marker. I went to the exercise assignment board where the sortie packages were listed with their flight leads in tactical positions and mission numbers. He found the entry for the distressed aircraft recovery. He added a notation in the tactical coordination column. One word. Then he stood back. The room noticed the addition gradually, the way rooms notice things not all at once, but in waves, person to person, a small ripple of attention moving from the front to the back. Switch read it first because she was closest. She read it and looked at Arden. Calloway read it and said nothing but put his hand briefly on Price's arm and pointed, and Price read it, and his expression did the thing that young pilots' expressions do when they understand for the first time that the person standing next to them in the ready room is someone they will tell stories about for the rest of their career. Hammer read it last. He stood in front of the board for a moment with his coffee in his hand and his jaw set in the specific way of a man who is processing something that confirms what he already knew, but that still lands harder than expected. The notation read, Wraith Primary Navigation and Recovery Coordination. Aircraft and crew recovered safely. Below it in Merrick's handwriting, a single line actions, consistent with previous documented performance. Attribution noted for record. Hammer turned around. Arden was at the back of the room talking to Chen, who had been on a different sortie package but had come to the full debrief because Arden had asked her to attend as a learning event. Arden was explaining something, drawing on a napkin, the way she did the same patient deliberate communication she used with every junior pilot who asked her something real. Hammer crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. Chen stepped back instinctively. Hammer looked at Arden for a moment. He had been thinking for 2 days about what he was going to say when this moment came. He had drafted versions. He had discarded them. He had concluded finally that the only language available for this kind of thing was the simplest. He said, I decided who you were before watching you fly. Arden looked at him. That was wrong, he said. He did not expand on it. He did not soften it or contextualize it or add the qualifying clauses that people add when they want to apologize without fully giving ground. He said it plain and stood in it. Arden held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, a lot of people do. That doesn't make it acceptable. No, she agreed, it doesn't. They looked at each other. Hammer said, the routing correction you filed on day 2, the navigation catch in the first brief, the weather replanning. He paused. I saw all of it. I know you did. I didn't say anything. I know that too. Another pause. Hammer said, I'm saying something now. Arden was quiet for a moment. Then she said in the voice of someone who has thought carefully about the difference between accepting an apology and pretending the injury did not occur, I heard you. It was not forgiveness offered wholesale in an instant. It was the beginning of something, the first careful step on a surface that had been broken and was being tested for weight. Hammer nodded. He left. Chen watched him go, then looked at Arden. What just happened? Arden looked at the board across the room at the entry with Wraith written in Merrick's handwriting. She said the room changed. Chen looked at the board, then at Arden. Because of what you did in the recovery. Because of what everyone did, Arden said. Your wingman partner. The control agency that adjusted their routing. Hammer holding the frequency open while I worked the direct link. She paused. No one recovers an aircraft alone. Chen absorbed this. Then she said carefully as if testing the words, but you were the one who saw the terrain problem. Arden looked at her. Yes. How did you know to check it? I reviewed the recovery corridors the night before. Chen was quiet. Nobody told you to do that. No, why did you? Arden considered the question. She answered it the way she answered everything, not with a performance, not with inspiration, but with the plain truth as she understood it. Because my father told me you can't control the sky. You can only control what you did before you got in it. She paused. I got in it. I wanted to have done the work. Chen looked at her for a long time. Then she said quietly, I'm going to review tomorrow's corridors tonight. Arden looked at her. She said, good. That night, the squadron had an informal gathering that was not quite a celebration and not quite a debrief, but was somewhere between the two. The kind of gathering that forms naturally after a high-stakes event has resolved safely, and the people involved need to be in the same room together to complete the process of coming down from it. Arden went. Switch made sure of it, appearing at Arden's door with her jacket and a look that communicated non-negotiability, and Arden went without argument because she had learned that some battles were not worth the energy required to fight them. The bar was loud and warm. Arden took her usual position slightly outside the main cluster water in hand close enough to be present but not deep enough to be the center. Except that tonight the main cluster had rearranged itself slightly. People kept drifting toward her edge. Not dramatically, not as a group, but individually, a pilot she had spoken to twice before finding a reason to stand nearby. Calloway appearing with a question that was technically a question, but was actually an excuse to be in the conversation. The partner nation liaison officer stopping to shake her hand again and say something in his own language that Switch later told her with a slight smile, translated roughly to, "The best pilots always look like they are not trying." Arden endured this with the expression of someone undergoing a procedure they understand is necessary. At one point, she found herself standing next to Hammer, not by design, by the natural gravitational drift of a room that had reorganized around a new center. They stood side by side for a moment without speaking, looking at the same general direction, which was the common social posture of two people who have not yet worked out the full vocabulary of a new dynamic. Hammer said, eventually, "Your father taught you to fly." Arden glanced at him. "He taught me to read the air." "What's the difference?" She was quiet for a moment. "Flying is mechanics. Reading the air is understanding that the aircraft is the smallest part of the system." Hammer thought about this. "Montana, right? That's where you grew up. Outside Great Falls. Crop dusters. He maintained them, repaired them. I grew up in the hangar." Hammer nodded slowly. He said, "I grew up in Phoenix. My father sold insurance." Arden looked at him. He almost smiled. "Yeah, I know." She said, "Did you always want to fly fighters?" "Since I was 6, he said. "Air show, F-18 solo demo. Straight up to 8,000 feet in about 4 seconds. He shook his head. "Never wanted anything else." Arden nodded. "What do you want now?" He looked at her. "From the squadron," she clarified. "What do you want it to be?" I was quiet for a moment. Then in the voice of someone accessing something honest, "I want it to be the best unit these pilots have ever been part of. I want them to look back in 20 years and know this is where they learned what real flying means." Arden said, "Then we want the same thing." Hammer looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived in his squadron, there was no evaluation in his expression, no positioning, no performance. Just one pilot looking at another pilot, both of them tired and coming down from something real, both of them understanding for the first time in the same room at the same time that they had been working toward the same thing from opposite ends. He said, "Yeah, I think we do." Switch appeared between them at exactly the wrong moment, which was possibly the right moment, with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who has been watching this particular slow-motion development for weeks and has opinions about its pace. She handed 1 coffee to each of them. She said, "The partner nation flight lead wants to buy you both a drink. I told him you don't drink on exercise nights." He said that's the most professional thing he's heard all week. Hammer took the coffee. He's not wrong. Switch looked at Arden. "You doing okay?" Arden considered the question seriously the way she considered all questions that deserved a real answer. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." Switch held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once in the way of someone who believes what they're hearing. She went back to the main cluster. Arden and Hammer stood in their corner of the room, both with coffee, both watching the same people, both inside the same unit, which 3 weeks ago had seemed to contain 2 entirely separate worlds, and was now slowly imperfectly, one honest conversation at a time, beginning to become one. Across the room on a chair pushed slightly back from the main table, Maeve Chen was in conversation with the partner nation wing man, drawing something on a napkin, her voice quiet but clear, her posture forward, her expression alive with the particular energy of someone who has recently discovered that what they know matters. Arden noticed. She did not say anything. She looked back at the coffee in her hand. Her father had told her once, standing in a Montana field while a crop duster made its low pass over the wheat, "You can spend your whole life waiting for someone to tell you you're worth the air you're in, or you can just be ready and let the sky decide." She had spent 3 weeks in this squadron being exactly what she had always been. The sky had decided, and the room finally was catching up. The morning after the exercise, the squadron woke up different, not dramatically, not in the way that movies present transformation with swelling music and slow-motion walks down flight line corridors and meaningful glances exchanged between characters who have finally arrived at understanding. It was quieter than that and more real. People came into the ready room, and the geometry of the space had shifted by something immeasurable but unmistakable. The way furniture in a familiar room feels different after someone has moved one piece, even if you can't immediately identify which one. Arden felt it the moment she walked in. Calloway looked up and nodded without the hesitation that had previously qualified every interaction he had with her. Price moved his gear off the chair beside him without being asked, which was a small thing, but Price moving anything without being asked was not a small thing. Chen was already at the planning table with her quarter review open, and when Arden sat down across from her, Chen slid the review toward her without a word, in the manner of someone presenting work to a person whose opinion they have decided to value. Arden read it. She made 2 notations. She slid it back. Chen looked at the notations. He looked at Arden. She said, "The second one, I almost caught that myself." "You would have," Arden said. "Give it another pass before the brief and you'll see it." Chen looked at the notation again. Then she nodded and turned back to the document with the focused expression of someone running a specific search, and 30 seconds later, she said quietly to herself, "There it is." That was the first 3 minutes of the morning. It set the tone for everything that followed. The workup schedule had entered its final phase before the formal evaluation period, which meant the sorties were longer. The scenarios were more complex, and the margin for the kind of institutional softness that accumulates in any unit over time had essentially disappeared. Merrick ran the schedule with the precision of a man who understood that the evaluation was not the goal. The evaluation was the proof of the goal, and the goal was a squadron capable of performing when the conditions were worst and the stakes were real. He had begun including Arden in the morning planning sessions. Not officially, not with a formal designation. He simply started appearing at the planning table at the same time she did, which was early in asking questions in the way that commanding officers ask questions when they are not looking for information, but are shaping the direction of a conversation by the questions they choose to pose. "Walk me through the threat timeline on the northern corridor," he said on the first morning of the final phase. Arden walked him through it. He asked 3 follow-up questions. 2 of them were about contingencies she had already planned for. The third was about a scenario she had not considered, and she said so directly, and then worked through the contingency in real time while he watched, and her analysis was incomplete in one respect and correct in all others, and she identified the incomplete part herself before he pointed it out. He said nothing about that, but the next morning, he was at the table again. And the morning after, Hammer noticed this. He noticed it with a specific quality of attention that was different from jealousy. Though jealousy was present, honest accounting required him to admit that, and more like the recognition of a man watching a process he had been excluded from by his own earlier choices. He had spent 3 weeks dismissing Arden. In those 3 weeks, Merrick had been watching her. The CO had seen everything Hammer had refused to see and was now acting on that information. And Hammer was standing on the outside of a professional relationship that he could have been part of if he had paid the right kind of attention when it mattered. I made a decision. He went to the planning table on the 4th morning of the final phase before Merrick arrived, before anyone else was in, and sat down across from Arden with a coffee in each hand. He set one in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "I want to understand how you think about the threat timeline on the northern corridor." She studied him for a moment, not suspiciously but carefully, in the way of someone assessing whether a question is being asked because the asker wants the answer, or because the asker wants something else. Whatever she found in his expression satisfied her. She opened her notebook. They worked for an hour before anyone else arrived. When Merrick came in and found both of them at the table, he stopped in the doorway for approximately 1 second. His expression did not change. He got coffee. He sat down at the end of the table. He said, "The secondary threat egress. Walk me through it." Hammer said, "Arden's been revising the timing." Merrick looked at Arden. She looked at the notebook. She walked them through it. That morning had a different quality from all the mornings that had preceded it, not because the work was different, but because the people doing it had reorganized themselves in a way that was functional rather than performative, and functional was what the final evaluation phase required. What nobody in the planning session knew was that the final evaluation phase was going to deliver something the scenario writers had not included. 2 days later, during the most complex sortie package of the entire workup cycle, a large force employment exercise involving 12 aircraft, 2 command and control agencies' partner nation assets, in a layered threat environment that required precise coordination across 3 different frequency bands, a problem developed that had nothing to do with the scenario. It began with a radio call from Callaway. I was flying the number 3 position in the second force ship, a tactical position that required him to maintain formation discipline while also managing his own sensor picture, and he had been performing well better than anyone had expected, given his hesitancy in the early weeks. His voice on the radio had gotten cleaner, more precise-shaped, partly by the coaching Arden had given him informally, and partly by the accelerating demands of the workup schedule, which had a way of compressing development timelines simply by making the alternative not developing too expensive. The radio call was 2 words: fuel state. It was not an emergency declaration. It was the kind of transmission that a pilot makes when something in the numbers has shifted and they are flagging it before it becomes critical rather than after. But the 2 words landed on Arden's frequency with a weight that she recognized immediately because she had spent enough hours reviewing mishap reports to know that fuel state emergencies almost never announce themselves dramatically. They arrived in precisely this way: a quiet flag, a number slightly worse than expected, a margin that was still within limits, but trending in the wrong direction at exactly the wrong point in the mission. She came up on the frequency. Callaway Wraith, say fuel state. He gave the number. She ran the calculation in her head while simultaneously maintaining her own position in the formation. The number was not critical. It was not yet emergency territory. But the planned recovery sequencing for the large force exercise assumed a standard recovery flow that would put Callaway's aircraft in a holding pattern for approximately 9 minutes before his approach turn, and 9 minutes at current fuel burn put him at a margin that Arden did not like. She said, Hammer Wraith, Callaway's fuel state requires a priority recovery. Recommend we pull him out of the holding flow and sequence him first. Hammer's response came in 2 seconds. What's his current state? She gave the number. A pause. She knew he was running the same calculation. She waited. Hammer said, agree. Callaway Hammer, you're pulling out of the flow. Come left heading 340, descend to Angels 8. Wraith has you. Callaway said, copy. Left 340, Angels 8. What followed was 12 minutes of careful, precise management. Arden maintaining awareness of Callaway's position and fuel burn, while continuing to manage her own responsibilities in the exercise. Hammer coordinating the adjustment to the recovery sequence with the control agency, both of them operating with the specific competence of people who have, over the past several weeks, learned exactly how the other one thinks under pressure. The control agency pushed back on the priority recovery because it disrupted their flow. Arden said on the command frequency in the flat, certain voice she used when there was no room for debate. His fuel state requires it. We're doing the priority recovery. The control agency said, confirm you're declaring emergency fuel. Not yet, Arden said. I'm preventing it. That's the point. A pause from the agency, then approved. Callaway, you're number 1 in the recovery. Callaway landed with margin, not comfortable. Margin, not the kind of number anyone wanted to see in a training environment, but margin. He was safe. The aircraft was safe. In the debrief, the exercise evaluators flagged the fuel state development as a training point. They noted the timeline the radio calls the coordination between flight lead and tactical coordinator. They said the response had been textbook. Then one of the evaluators said something that was not in the script. He said the anticipation. The call was made before the state became critical. That's not textbook, that's experience. Who made the initial call to pull him out of the flow? Hammer said Wraith. The evaluator wrote something. Callaway, sitting 3 rows back, looked at Arden with an expression that was more complex than gratitude. It was the expression of a pilot who has just understood viscerally and completely that the margin between a normal training debrief and a different kind of conversation entirely had been measured in one person's attention and one precise radio call. After the debrief, he found her in the corridor. He said, you caught it before I fully understood what I was looking at. Arden said, you made the call. That's what matters. You knew what the call meant before I did. She looked at him. Next time you'll know before I do. That's the point. Callaway absorbed this. He said, how do I get there to seeing it that way? Arden said, stop asking where the problem is. Start asking where the problem will be. She paused. Every flight, every scenario. Where is this going in 12 seconds? Where is it going in 30? Work backward from there. He nodded slowly. She said, and review the mishap reports, not for the technical data, for the moment where somebody stopped asking that question. Calloway looked at her. You've read all of them. Everyone I can access. He was quiet. Then, how many is that? Enough, she said, to know that almost every one of them had a moment where someone had the information and didn't act on it quickly enough. She left him in the corridor with that because that was where she left people, not with inspiration, not with speeches, but with the specific thought that would still be working on them at 2 in the morning when they couldn't sleep. That evening, Merrick called her into his office. She came in and sat across from him, notebook in hand from habit, and he looked at the notebook and then at her and said, "You don't need that." She set it on her knee. He said, "The evaluators filed their interim report this afternoon." Arden waited. "The fuel state management on today's sortie is in there," he said. "So is the recovery coordination from the partner nation incident. So is the initial threat catch from the first brief, which one of the evaluators found in the planning record." She said nothing. "The interim language," Merrick said carefully, "describes a tactical coordinator who demonstrated consistent distributed situational awareness under complex conditions." He paused. That phrase, distributed situational awareness. Does it sound familiar? Arden looked at him steadily. It was the exact phrase from her restricted evaluation, the one from the previous deployment, the one that had described what she did the night she stayed with the damaged aircraft and guided it home. "I said, yes, sir. The evaluating commander from your previous assignment," Merrick said as one of the senior observers on this evaluation panel. Arden was very still. "He recognized the descriptor," Merrick said. "He put 2 and 2 together." Another pause. "He came to see me this afternoon." Arden said nothing. Merrick looked at her directly. He wanted to confirm that Wraith and Lieutenant Arden Vale were the same person. The office was very quiet. Arden said, "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes." Merrick held her gaze. "I also told him that you had asked for your name to be withheld from the original report and that this squadron had already spent 3 weeks learning what happens when people don't look carefully enough at who is standing in front of them." He paused. He appreciated the context. Arden was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What happens now?" "What happens now," Merrick said, "is that the evaluation continues, the squadron performs. And you," he said in a tone that was not commanding and not gentle, but was somewhere in the territory of both, "you stop trying to stay invisible." She looked at him. "You were never invisible," he said. "You were in a room full of people who weren't looking." "That's different." He picked up his coffee. "They're looking now." She left his office and stood in the corridor for a moment. Switch was there. Of course she was. Arden said, "Were you listening?" Switch said, "I was walking past." The third time today. Switch almost smiled. "Merrick told you to stop hiding. He told me to stop trying to stay invisible." Same thing. Arden looked at the corridor wall. "I wasn't hiding. I was doing the work." "You can do both," Switch said. "People can see you working. That's allowed." She shifted her weight. "The junior pilots in this squadron are watching you every single day. Not because of Wraith, not because of the partner nation recovery. They're watching because you're the first person in this building who has ever treated their questions like they were worth answering." Arden looked at her. Switch said, "Chen reviewed the corridors last night. Price asked me this morning if there was a list of the mishap reports you've been reading. Calloway has started coming in early." She paused. "You did that, not by giving a speech, not by making a reputation, by just being the person you are where they could see it." Arden was quiet. Then she said, "Chen's going to be better than me." Switch looked at her sharply. Arden said, "She sees things I have to calculate. She's going to be better than me in 2 years." Switch stared at her for a long moment. "You know what the really remarkable thing about you is?" Arden waited. "That doesn't bother you at all," Switch said. Arden considered this. "Why would it?" Switch shook her head slowly in the particular way of someone confronting a quality they have spent their whole life understanding intellectually but have never seen fully embodied. "I don't know," she said, "but it would bother almost everyone else." The final week of the evaluation phase produced 3 more significant training events, each of which added something to the picture that the evaluation panel was assembling. The first was a large force deconfliction problem that developed in real time during an exercise sortie and required the flight lead to make a rapid decision about formation geometry that had downstream effects on 4 other aircraft. Hammer made the call. It was a good call, decisive, tactically sound, made in the right window. But it was based on a threat picture that Arden had communicated to him 30 seconds earlier. And the precision of her situational update was what made the decision possible in the timeline required. In the debrief, Hammer described the sequence exactly as it had occurred. He did not soften his reliance on her assessment. He did not present the decision as something he had arrived at independently. He said, Wraith's threat picture update was what gave me the geometry to make the call. Without that update at that timing, I'm making a slower decision with worse information. The evaluator wrote, the second event was a communication failure during a night sortie that required the formation to operate on backup procedures for 11 minutes. Backup procedures were drilled but rarely tested in actual flight, and the natural response to communication failure in a complex airspace environment was a compression of tempo pilots trying to do too much at once, trying to reestablish communication while also maintaining position and executing their mission profile, producing the kind of task saturation that was the precursor to the errors that mishap reports were full of. Arden's response to the communication failure was to immediately reduce her own tempo. She cut her transmissions to minimum. She established visual contact with her wingman. She used the backup signals they had briefed, hand signals, wing rocks, the visual language of aviation that predated radio, by 50 years, and she maintained formation integrity while the communication failure was worked. When the primary frequency came back online, the formation was still together, still on profile, still within parameters. The evaluator noted the backup communication management specifically. The third event was what nobody expected because the third event was not a tactical problem. It was a people problem, and people problems in fleet aviation are the ones that training manuals address least effectively. During a planning session, 3 days before the end of the evaluation period, a disagreement developed between two senior pilots about the optimal strike approach for the final exercise package. The disagreement was technical at its surface: routing, geometry, threat, timing, suppression, sequencing, but underneath the technical disagreement was a status argument, the kind that develops when two experienced pilots have incompatible visions of how the mission should unfold, and neither one is willing to be wrong in front of their peers. The planning session had been running for 90 minutes, and the argument had been running for 40 of them, and nobody had been able to move it forward because the two pilots in question were both senior enough that the junior officers in the room didn't feel positioned to intervene, and the intervention from operations had not resolved the technical disagreement in a way that either pilot accepted. Arden had been at the table the entire time, not speaking. At the 90-minute mark, she said, without raising her voice or standing up or doing anything that signaled she was about to shift the energy of the room. The core disagreement is about the suppression timing window. Can we put the actual numbers on the board? The room looked at her. She said to no one specifically, if the timing window is above 6 seconds, the southern approach is optimal. If it's below 6 seconds, the northern approach is better. The argument is really about which number is correct. Can we look at the most current threat data and find out? Silence. One of the arguing pilots said the number is 4.8. The other said the updated reference puts it at 6.3. Arden said, which reference? The second pilot cited it. Arden pulled it up on the planning terminal. She read the relevant section. She said the 6.3 figure is the maximum acquisition range parameter. At the planned ingress altitude, the effective figure is 5.1. Both pilots looked at the terminal. Arden said, 5.1 puts us below the threshold. The southern approach carries higher risk. She paused. Northern approach is correct. The room was quiet. The first pilot, the one who had been arguing for the northern approach, said nothing. He did not claim vindication. He looked at the terminal and then at Arden and nodded once in the way of someone accepting a resolution. The second pilot said, after a moment, I was using the wrong parameter. Arden said, it was in a footnote, easy to miss. He nodded. The planning session continued. Afterward, Merrick pulled Arden aside in the corridor. He said, that was well managed. She said, the math was right. The math was right, he agreed, but you presented it in a way that let both of them keep their footing. He paused. You've done that before. She said, it's not useful to make someone feel stupid when you need them to fly a good mission the next morning. Merrick looked at her for a moment. He said, "Where did you learn that?" She was quiet. "My father used to say when you're working on an engine with someone, you don't want them angry when they hand you the next tool." Merrick smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile without any of the evaluative quality that usually accompanied his expressions. Just a man who had heard something true and recognized it. He said, "How is he, Jean?" She looked at him. "He's well, still in Montana." "Does he know about Wraith?" The question was direct enough that it required a direct answer. She said, "He knows I had an incident on deployment that went well. I didn't give him specifics." "Why not?" She thought about this honestly. "Because he would have worried about the part where my fuel was at the edge, and the outcome was fine. There was no point in giving him the part that would have scared him after the fact." Merrick nodded slowly. "He raised someone who thinks about what other people carry," he said. She said nothing. He said, "That's not a common quality." She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. "He lost my mother when I was 9. He raised me alone. Everything he had, he put into making sure I was ready for the parts of life that don't warn you." She paused. "I don't know if he knows how well that worked, but it worked." Merrick held her gaze. He said, "After the evaluation closes, I'm recommending you for inclusion in the Advanced Tactics Instructor Pipeline." Arden went very still. The Advanced Tactics Instructor Pipeline was not a routine posting. It was a selective program that identified pilots with the specific combination of tactical skill and teaching ability that fleet aviation needed at the most senior instruction level. The pipeline produced the instructors who taught the instructors. It was the kind of assignment that shaped how the entire community flew not just one squadron, not just one deployment cycle, but across years and aircraft and the slow accumulation of institutional knowledge. That was the difference between a force that learned from its mistakes and one that repeated them. She said, "Sir," he said, "you have the tactical capacity. You've demonstrated that repeatedly." He paused. "What I wasn't certain about was whether you had the teaching instinct, whether you could take what you know and give it to someone else in a form they could actually use." He paused again. "Chen, Calloway, Price, the planning session today." He looked at her. "You have it." She said, "I don't know if I'm ready." He said, "That's the right answer." He said it firmly without irony. "Anyone who tells me they're ready for that pipeline before I recommend them is telling me they don't understand what it requires." He paused. "You'll be ready. You'll be ready because you'll work until you are the same way you've worked at everything else." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, sir." He said, "Thank your father. I'm just reading the result." He walked back toward his office. Arden stood in the corridor. She thought about her father in the hangar outside Great Falls in the specific cold of a Montana morning, with engine grease on his hands and a crop duster on the lift, in the particular patience of a man who understood that every machine had its own logic, and that logic had to be found rather than forced. She thought about what he had given her. Not just the flying, not just the technical knowledge, the wind reading the instrument, cross-check, the habit of arriving prepared. He had given her the capacity to be still inside a loud room. He had given her the certainty that attention was not the same as worth. He had given her the knowledge that the sky did not care how she entered it, only what she did once she was there. She pulled out her notebook. She wrote 2 lines. She closed it. She went back to the planning table where Chen was reviewing corridor data with the focused expression of someone who had recently understood that the work mattered and had decided to give it everything she had. Arden sat down. She said, "Show me what you have." Chen turned the notebook toward her. Arden began reading. Outside the flight line was quiet. The aircraft sat in their positions waiting for the morning. The evaluation period had 3 days left. The squadron would perform or it would not, and the measurement would be precise and external and would not care about the internal reorganization that had taken place over the past several weeks. The shifted geometry, the adjusted attention, the slow and difficult work of a group of people revising their understanding of one another. But Merrick knew what he had. Hammer, sitting in the ready room with a debrief printout and a cold coffee, was beginning to understand what he had been part of, both the failure of the early weeks and the correction that had followed. Switch reviewing weather data at the table across from Arden, and Chen was thinking about nothing in particular and everything simultaneously, which was her version of contentment. And Calloway, in his quarters, was lying on his bunk and with a mishap report open on his chest, asking himself for the first time with real discipline, with the genuine forward-looking attention of someone who had been taught to look not where the problem was, where it was going. He read until midnight. The evaluation results came back on a Friday. Merrick read them in his office with the door closed, which was unusual enough that his administrative officer noticed and made a point of not knocking for anything short of an actual emergency. He read the full document twice, then set it on his desk and sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who has been waiting for a confirmation he already knew was coming, but that still lands with its full weight when it arrives. The squadron had passed the evaluation at the highest rating issued in the command's current cycle. The evaluating commander's narrative summary used specific language that was unusual in formal evaluation documents. Language that named individuals, described specific decision sequences, and attributed outcomes to particular choices made under pressure. This was not standard. Evaluation summaries were typically written in the institutional passive voice that distributed credit diffusely and avoided the political complications of naming names in formal records. This one named Wraith 4 times. Merrick called the full squadron together that afternoon. He read the relevant sections aloud. He did not editorialize. He did not add commentary. He simply read what the evaluation panel had written in the panel's own words and let the language carry what it needed to carry. When he reached the section that described the partner nation recovery in the fuel state management in the planning session, deconfliction, he read it straight through without pausing, and the room listened with the particular quality of attention that people bring to things they know are true because they were there when they happened. When he finished, he set the document on the table. He said, "This squadron earned this. Every person in this room contributed to this result." He paused. "Some of you have been in this building for years. Some of you arrived 8 weeks ago." He did not look at Arden when he said that. He didn't need to. What the evaluation panel saw is what I have been watching develop since the first week of the workup cycle. A unit that learned to look at itself honestly and adjust. Another pause. That is harder than it sounds. Most units don't do it. This one did. He picked up the document. He said, "Dismissed." The room broke into the particular noise of people who have received good news and don't quite know what to do with it. Yet part relief, part pride, part the slightly disoriented energy of tension that has been held for weeks, finally releasing all at once. Calloway grabbed Price's arm and said something that made Price laugh. Chen sat very still for a moment, and then looked at her hands, and then at the ceiling, and then pressed her lips together in the expression of someone containing something large. Switch looked at Arden across the room with the particular economy of a person who expresses a great deal by expressing very little. Hammer crossed the room and stood next to Arden. He did not say anything immediately. He stood beside her and looked at the board where Wraith was still written beside her tail number, and where the evaluation notation had been added below it in Merrick's handwriting. Then he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" Arden waited. "Day 1, he said, "you caught the threat timing in the first brief." "You were right." The briefer corrected the plan. He paused. "I made a joke about whether you actually flew fighters." Arden said nothing. "The plan got corrected," he said, "because of what you saw, and I responded by making a joke." He shook his head slowly. "I keep thinking about what that means, about who was in the room and what they were watching me do." Arden said, "They were watching a senior pilot manage his position." Hammer looked at her. "That's a diplomatic way to say it." "It's accurate," she said. "You were doing what the environment rewarded. That's not a character failure. It's a systems problem." Somehow was quiet. "Most people would just call it a character failure. Most people," she said, "are not trying to fix it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You believe that?" "Yes." "Why?" She considered the question the way she considered all real questions, without hurry, without performance. "Because I've watched you for 8 weeks. The person who erased my work in that briefing room is not the same person who named me in the debrief last week. People change when the information changes and they're willing to look at it." She paused. "You looked at it." Hammer held her gaze. He said, "I would have missed the fuel state on Calloway." "Maybe." "Not maybe. My attention was on the threat picture. I wouldn't have caught the fuel drift when I did." "You would have caught it," she said, "possibly 60 seconds later." 60 seconds matters. "Yes," she said, "it does." He nodded. He said, "Thank you for that." He said it plainly, the way he had been learning to say things since the night he called his former squadron mate and sat at his kitchen table in the dark with the weight of a rearranged understanding. Not for the fuel state call, for all of it. For not walking out of this squadron the first week when you had every reason to. Arden looked at the board. She said the mission was worth staying for. Hammer said, "That's all it takes for you, isn't it? The mission being worth it." She looked at him. "Isn't that enough?" He thought about it honestly. "For most people, no," he said. "Most people need the room to see them." Arden said, "I spent a long time learning not to need that." He said, "It shows." She said, "It shouldn't have to." The weight of that landed between them quietly without drama. It was the truest thing either of them had said to each other, and they both knew it, and there was nothing to add to it, so neither of them tried. The squadron moved into its deployment cycle 2 weeks later. In the story of those weeks, the briefing room, the erased whiteboard, the partner nation recovery, the fuel state call, the evaluation result traveled the way. Stories travel in tight communities, which is to say quietly and completely, through channels that have no official existence and that carry information more reliably than formal communication ever does. Pilots who had been at other squadrons heard versions of it. Some of the versions were accurate, some had the details wrong, but the essential truth intact. By the time the deployment ended and the squadron returned and the workup cycle began again, with a new group of pilots moving through the pipeline, the name Wraith had acquired a specific meaning in the community that was not quite legend and not quite reputation, but was somewhere between the two. The story of a pilot who had been invisible to the people around her, not because she lacked anything, but because the people around her had not been paying the right kind of attention. What happened 3 years later was not something Arden had planned for, and was not something she had been waiting for. And yet, when it arrived, it felt like the logical conclusion of everything that had preceded it. Merrick called her on a Tuesday morning. She was at her current assignment, a follow-on posting after the Advanced Tactics Instructor pipeline, which she had completed at the top of her cohort, not through any dramatic final evaluation performance, but through the slow accumulation of a teaching record that the pipeline supervisors described in her completion assessment as the most consistent they had observed in the program's recent history. Merrick said, "There's a position at Lemoore, Senior Tactics Instructor, full billet." He paused. "They asked for my recommendation." Arden said, "What did you tell them?" "I told them they were asking the wrong question," he said. "I told them the question wasn't whether you were qualified. The question was whether you were willing." A pause on the line. He said, "Are you willing?" She thought about what returning to Lemoore meant. The ready room where she had sat in the back row with her notebook and her worn flight bag, and her absolute silence where a senior pilot had asked in front of 40 people whether she actually flew fighters or just took notes about them, where a commanding officer had walked to a board and erased her name and written one word in its place, where a squadron had slowly and perfectly, honestly revised its understanding of what competence looked like when it didn't perform. She thought about Chen, who was now a lieutenant commander at her own squadron, and who had called Arden 2 months ago to say that she had caught a critical threat timing error in a major exercise brief, and that the entire time she was doing it, she was hearing Arden's voice in her head saying, "Stop asking where the problem is, start asking where it's going." She thought about Calloway, who had stopped her at a fleet symposium 6 months earlier and said without preamble, "I read every mishap report I can access. Everyone, I've been doing it for 2 years." He had said it the way people report facts that have changed their lives, simply without ceremony, in the voice of someone for whom the change has become so integrated that it no longer feels dramatic. She thought about her father. She said yes. She arrived at Lemoore on a Monday morning in early spring 3 years and 4 months after the first time she had walked through those doors with one duffel bag and a worn flight notebook in the particular quietness that made people in loud rooms uncomfortable. This time people looked up when she came in, not because she had changed the way she walked or the way she carried herself or the way she looked at a room. She had not. She was still the same measured, deliberate, fundamentally quiet person who had sat in the back row and written in her notebook while a senior pilot made jokes at her expense. They looked up because word had gotten there before her. It always did now. The new cohort of pilots in the Advanced Tactics course was 12 people. 8 of them had been in the fleet long enough to have heard some version of the race story. 4 of them were new enough that the name meant nothing yet. All 12 of them were in the briefing room at 0800 notebooks open, the particular mixture of competitiveness and anxiety and performance that you always found in a room full of people who had been selected for something demanding and knew it. Arden walked in. She set her notebook on the table. She looked at the room for a moment, not evaluating, not performing her authority, just looking in the specific way of someone taking an honest inventory. She said, "My name is Lieutenant Commander Arden Vale. My call sign is Wraith. If you've heard the story, some of it is probably accurate and some of it is probably not, and we're not going to spend time on it either way." She paused. What we are going to spend time on is this. Every one of you was selected for this course because someone decided you had the foundation. What you do not have yet is the structure that goes on top of the foundation. That's what this course builds. The room was very still. "I'm going to tell you one thing on the first day," she said, "and I'm going to come back to it on the last day, and I want you to measure the distance between those two moments." She paused. Confidence is useful in a fighter cockpit. Certainty about another human being, about what they know, what they can do, what they're worth, is dangerous. She let that sit. You are going to meet people in your careers who look wrong for the room they're in. They're going to be too quiet or too young or from the wrong background, or they're going to arrive without the call sign you expect. And you are going to make a decision in the first 5 minutes about who they are. Another pause. This course hardly about tactics. It's also about teaching you to be wrong about people less often. Because in the air, the cost of being wrong about a person can be the same as the cost of being wrong about a threat. Nobody moved. A pilot in the second row, young, confident, the kind of physical ease in a room that came from having been good at things long enough that it felt natural, said, "How do you stop making that judgment? It's instinctive." Arden looked at him. "What's your name?" "Lieutenant Garvey, ma'am." "Garvey, you don't stop making the judgment. You make it provisional." She held his gaze. "You say, 'This is what I think I see,' and then you watch for evidence that you're wrong, actively. You build that into your process the same way you build threat assessment into your process." She paused. "Most people make the judgment and then look for evidence they're right. That's confirmation. It feels like observation. It isn't." Garvey said, "How do you know when you have got it right?" "You don't," she said. "You stay uncertain long enough to actually look." She picked up her marker. "Open your notebooks." The course ran for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, Arden did what she had always done. She arrived before everyone else. She stayed after everyone else. She reviewed every evaluation with a specific kind of attention that looked for what was going wrong before it became a trend rather than after it became a problem. She debriefed every sortie with the pilots directly, not in the group format that was standard for the course, but individually, one at a time, with the patient and precise communication of someone who understood that the information a pilot needed to hear was not always the same as the information a room full of pilots needed to hear. Garvey came to her after his third individual debrief. He had been flying well. His tactical instincts were good. His execution was consistent. His decision-making under pressure was in the top third of the cohort. But there was a pattern in his debriefs that Arden had been watching for 2 weeks, a tendency to talk over the explanation before he had fully received it, a kind of processing speed that was impressive in its pace and limited in its depth. She had been waiting for the right moment. After his third debrief, she said, "You heard everything I said in the last 15 minutes. He said, "Yes, ma'am." "What did you hear?" He summarized it accurately, comprehensively in about 45 seconds. She said, "Now tell me what it means for your next sortie." He paused. The pause was longer than she expected. He said, I'm not sure." She said, "That's the difference between hearing and understanding. You can hear fast. Understanding takes longer." She paused. "Your pace is your strength and your liability." "Same thing, just like anyone else's." He was quiet. She said, "What is your greatest strength as a pilot?" He said without hesitation. "I'm fast. I process quickly. I make decisions in the window." She said, "And your liability?" He said slowly, "I close the window before I should." She looked at him. He said, "I decide I have what I need before I've checked everything." "Yes," she said. He absorbed this. He said, "How do you fix it?" She said, "You don't fix it. You manage it. You build a check into your process specifically for the moment when you think you're done. When it feels complete, that's when you check again. She paused. Because that feeling is the moment you are most likely to have stopped looking too early. Garvey sat with this for a long moment. Then he said, "Is that what happened to the pilot whose aircraft you helped recover? The one from the deployment?" The question was direct enough that it required a direct answer. She said the crew had good instincts and sound training. What they had was a degraded situation that compressed faster than their planning had accounted for. It wasn't about a missed check. She paused. It was about having someone in the formation who had studied the recovery corridors the night before and knew where the options were when the options narrowed. He said, "You studied them because you thought something might go wrong. I studied them because I always study them." He said, every mission I can." He was quiet. "Then that's not normal." "I know. Most people don't do that." "I know that too." He said, "Why do you?" She thought about her father standing in a Montana field with the engine grease on his hands and the wind reading in his eyes, and the particular patience of a man who had spent his whole life understanding that the machine would tell you what it needed if you paid attention before it needed to tell you. Oz said, "Because my father taught me that you can't control what goes wrong. You can only control what you knew before it happened." Garvey held her gaze. He said, "I'm going to review tomorrow's corridors tonight." She said, "Good." He got up to leave. At the door he stopped. He turned around. He said, "Ma'am, the first day of the course, you said you were going to come back to the same thing on the last day." Arden waited. He said, "I think I already know what it is." She said, "Tell me." He said, "Confidence is useful. Certainty about a person is dangerous." He paused. "I came into this course certain about a lot of things, about who the good pilots were going to be, and who was going to struggle, and who was going to surprise everyone." He paused again. "I was wrong about 2 of the 3. Arden looked at him. He said, "The pilot I thought was going to struggle is the best tactical thinker in the cohort. I almost stopped listening to her in the first week because I decided she was behind." Arden said, "What changed?" He said, "She caught something in a brief that I missed. And I watched myself in real time almost dismiss it because it came from her." He stopped. "I caught myself doing it. That was new." Arden said, "That's the work." He looked at her for a moment. "Did someone catch themselves doing it to you?" She said, "Yes." "Did it change anything?" She thought about Hammer at the kitchen table in the dark. She thought about the planning session the morning after 2 coffees, an open notebook, an hour of work before anyone else arrived. She thought about a debrief where a senior pilot said her name out loud in a formal setting and did not soften it or qualify it or redirect the credit. She said, "It changed everything." Garvey nodded. He left. On the last day of the course, the court gathered for the final evaluation debrief. Merrick had driven up from his current command to observe, which was not required, and which communicated something simply by the fact of his presence, a man who did not make unnecessary trips making a trip. He sat in the back row. He did not speak during the debrief. He watched. The debrief ran 2 hours. When it concluded, Arden stood at the front of the room and looked at 12 pilots who were in her honest assessment better than they had been 6 weeks ago. Not just tactically, not just technically, but in the specific and difficult quality of being able to look at another person and hold the judgment provisional long enough to actually see them. She said, "First day, I told you that confidence was useful and certainty about a person was dangerous." She paused. "Last day, same thing, except now you've had 6 weeks of evidence." She looked at the room. "You've watched each other perform. You've been wrong about each other. You've caught yourselves being wrong. Some of you adjusted. All of you flew better when you did." She paused. "Take that into every squadron you're part of for the rest of your careers. Not the tactics, you'll refine the tactics for as long as you fly. Take the habit of staying uncertain long enough to actually look." The room was still. She said, dismissed. People moved. Conversations started. The particular energy of a final day filled the room. Relief, pride, the forward-looking focus of people who know that one thing has ended and something larger is beginning. Merrick crossed the room to where Arden was packing her notebook. He said, "The cohort evaluation is going to be strong." She said, "They did the work." He said, "You built the environment where the work was possible." He paused. "There's a difference." She looked at him. He said, "Garvey, He came into this course with a chip on his shoulder the size of a flight deck. What happened? She said he caught himself dismissing someone in the first week and it bothered him enough that he couldn't put it down. Merrick said, who was it? She said, the pilot he thought was going to struggle. She's the best tactical thinker in the cohort. Merrick nodded slowly. He said, and Garvey? She said, he's going to be excellent. He has the speed and now he has the check on the speed. She paused. He's going to catch things. Merrick said, because of this course. Because he was willing to be wrong about something, she said. The course just gave him the opportunity. He held her gaze for a moment. He said, how many pilots have you coached informally since the squadron? She thought about it honestly. Chen, Calloway, Price, the 3 junior grades from the deployment, the 4 pilots from the advanced tactics pipeline who had stayed in contact, Garvey's cohort, others in corridors and planning sessions, in debriefs, in bars, in over cold coffee at 5 in the morning without titles, without designation, simply because they had a question worth answering, and she had been in the room when they asked it. She said, I don't keep count. Merrick said, I do. She looked at him. Hugh said 23 pilots in the last 3 years who can be directly traced to conversations with you. Not formal instruction, not assigned mentorship, just you paying attention to who was in the room and what they needed. He paused. Chen made a fuel state call last month that her CO said was the best anticipatory fuel management he had seen in a junior pilot in 5 years. She wrote me to say it was because of what you told her about looking forward, not at where the problem was. Arden was quiet. He said, Calloway is going to make flight lead next quarter. Price is already in the instructor pipeline. He paused. The partner nation wingman from the exercise his squadron commander contacted me 6 months ago, said that pilot had transformed his approach to formation communications. Said something you told him about precision under stress had stayed with him. He paused. You didn't remember the conversation, did you? She said, I remember the wingman. I don't remember what I said. He remembers, Merrick said, word for word. She looked at the board at the front of the room where the course roster was still posted with 12 names in their evaluation notations. She thought about the old squadron board at Lemoore 3 years ago with the single word written beside her tail number. She thought about the room going silent. She thought about what she had felt in that moment, which was not triumph and not vindication and not the particular satisfaction of a person who has been proven right after a long period of being dismissed. What she had felt was the complicated weight of a name she had not chosen and did not fully know what to do with arriving in a room that had spent 3 weeks deciding she was nothing carried by a commanding officer, who had paid attention when no one else had. She understood it differently now. The name was not about her. The name was what happened when someone appeared in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment and did the thing that needed doing and then got out of the way. It was the description of a function, not a person. The function could belong to anyone willing to do the preparation, willing to hold the silence, willing to be still in a loud room for long enough to actually see what the room needed. She had embodied the function first. She had spent 3 years teaching others that the function was available to them too. That was the larger thing. That was what her father had been teaching her in the hangar outside Great Falls when the wind was wrong and the clouds were building and the afternoon was becoming something no one had planned for. Not that she specifically was ready, but that readiness was a practice daily and deliberate and unglamorous that any person willing to pay the cost could build. She packed her notebook. She looked at Merrick. She said, thank you for reading the file. He said, thank you for filling it. She left the briefing room. In the corridor, Garvey was waiting. He said, ma'am, one more thing. She stopped. He said, the pilot I almost dismissed in the first week. Her name is Lieutenant Ferris. She wants to know if she can contact you after the course. Arden said, tell her yes. He nodded. He said, she's going to be something. Arden looked at him. She said she already is. She walked the corridor toward the exit past the planning rooms and the scheduling offices and the simulator bays where she had arrived at 5 in the morning for 8 consecutive weeks 3 years ago before anyone in this building knew her name, before the board had been erased and rewritten, before a commanding officer had sat in an office with a restricted folder and understood what he was looking at. She pushed through the door. The air outside was cold and clean. She stood for a moment. She thought about her father. She took out her phone and called him. He answered on the third ring with the unhurried voice of a man who has spent his life in places where the pace was set by the weather and the work, rather than by anything human-made. She said, "Hi, Dad." He said, "How'd the course go?" She said, "Good, it went good." He said, "Your people ready?" She thought about Garvey checking his speed against a new internal standard. She thought about Ferris, whose name she now had, who had been sitting in the same position. Arden had once sat in the back row, the quiet one, the pilot. The room had almost decided not to look at. She thought about Chen making a fuel state call in a cockpit somewhere, hearing a voice in her head, looking forward instead of at the problem. She said, "Yes, they're ready." Her father said, "Good girl." She smiled. She walked to her car. She put her notebook on the passenger's seat the way she always did, because the notebook was never done. There was always another corridor to review, another timing problem to calculate, another question worth writing down before the answer disappeared. She had not started flying to become Wraith. She had not started teaching to build a legacy. She had started because a man in a hangar in Montana had shown her through 20 years of patient and glamorous preparation that the only meaningful question was not whether you were seen, not whether the room acknowledged you, not whether someone had written your name on a board. The only meaningful question was whether you were ready when everything went wrong. She had been ready. She had taught others to be ready. And in cockpits, in briefing rooms, in planning sessions, she would never see in decisions made at altitude, under pressure, in conditions nobody had forecast accurately in the moment. A pilot paused before closing the window and checked one more time in all of those places. The preparation she had poured into 23 people was already in the air, already working, already doing what it was always meant to do. The sky did not care how loudly you entered the room. It only cared whether you were ready. Arden Vale had been ready from the beginning, and now so were they.